Most people imagine that battles are decided by strength, by numbers, by how many tanks one side can put into the field, how thick their armor is, how powerful their guns are, and how quickly losses can be replaced. This belief is deeply ingrained in how modern war is remembered. We tend to picture victory as a matter of accumulation, where enough steel, enough firepower, and enough momentum eventually overwhelm any defense. By the summer of 1942, Nazi Germany still believed this almost without question. On paper, the Wehrmacht appeared to possess exactly what 20th century warfare demanded. Its armored divisions were experienced, shaped by years of rapid campaigns. Its commanders were veterans of Poland, France, and the opening phases of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Its doctrine emphasized speed, coordination, and decisive force. If war truly was a contest of material strength applied correctly, Germany should have been able to impose its will once again. Stalingrad appeared, at first glance, to fit neatly into this understanding of war. It looked like the kind of battle tanks were made to win. The city sat stretched along the west bank of the Volga River, long rather than deep, industrial rather than elegant, functional rather than symbolic in a traditional sense. Factories, rail yards, apartment blocks, and warehouses dominated the landscape. In many places it was exposed, in others it was dense and cluttered. German planners viewed it as another obstacle on the road eastward. They assumed Soviet resistance would behave as it had before, stubborn at first, then brittle under sustained pressure. The expectation was familiar: encircle, apply force, fracture the defense, and move on. The Sixth Army, reinforced with armor and supported by the Luftwaffe, was tasked with seizing the city quickly. Control of the Volga crossings would sever Soviet transport routes. Securing Stalingrad would protect the northern flank of Germany's southern advance toward the Caucasus oil fields. The logic appeared sound: break the Red Army's defenses, occupy the city, deny the Soviets the river, and continue the campaign. The assumption underneath all of this was that German strength, properly applied, would determine the outcome. What German planners failed to grasp was that Stalingrad was not a battlefield where tanks could decide the outcome at all. By the time German forces reached the outskirts of the city in late summer, the campaign had already drifted far beyond its original assumptions. Distances were greater than anticipated. Resistance was more persistent. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers across hostile territory that had already been stripped of resources. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food arrived irregularly, in reduced quantities, or sometimes not at all. The tanks that had once driven lightning advances across open terrain now spent long periods idle, waiting for fuel deliveries or repairs. Mechanical failures accumulated faster than they could be addressed. Each kilometer eastward transformed German superiority from something tangible into something increasingly theoretical. Still, German command remained confident in the underlying principle. If mobility was reduced, concentration of force would compensate. If tanks could no longer dominate open ground, they could support infantry in close combat. If speed was lost, firepower would decide the issue instead. This belief followed the Sixth Army as it entered the city itself, where theory would collide with reality. Stalingrad was already devastated before most of the ground fighting began. Luftwaffe bombing raids flattened entire districts. Factories collapsed inward. Apartment blocks were reduced to skeletal frames. Warehouses disintegrated into jagged fields of concrete, brick, and twisted metal. From the air, the destruction looked complete. From above, it appeared as though the city had been erased. On the ground, however, this devastation produced something entirely different. It created a landscape without clear lines of sight, without predictable movement, without the spatial order that armored warfare depends upon. Streets were blocked by rubble. Buildings became layered defensive positions rather than singular structures. Cellars, basements, sewers, and shattered walls offered concealment at every level. Vertical space mattered as much as horizontal space. The environment eliminated range, restricted maneuver, and shattered coordination. These were not secondary effects. They directly neutralized the advantages that tanks were designed to provide. German armor entered the city expecting to support infantry advances, but instead found itself trapped by the terrain. Tanks were forced into narrow corridors where they could not maneuver freely. Turrets could not rotate fully. Visibility was limited to a few meters at best. Threats appeared from above, below, and behind. Soviet anti-tank teams did not require heavy weapons or long-range engagements. Molotov cocktails, magnetic mines, and improvised explosives were enough. At close range, armor thickness mattered far less than exposure. A tank that could dominate open terrain at 1,000 meters became dangerously vulnerable at 10. Losses accumulated steadily, not through dramatic armored clashes, but through attrition. One vehicle disabled by debris, another immobilized by mechanical failure, a crew killed while attempting a repair, a tank abandoned because it could not be recovered under fire. On paper, replacement tanks still existed. In reality, delivering them required fuel Germany increasingly lacked, rail capacity already stretched to the breaking point, and maintenance facilities under constant strain. The armored force shrank, not only through combat, but through exhaustion. At the same time, the Soviet command adapted faster than German planners anticipated. Rather than attempting to defeat German armor directly, they adjusted how and where they fought. They accepted losses. They yielded ground when necessary. Most importantly, they learned to stay close. The Red Army discovered that proximity itself was a weapon. By remaining near German positions, they reduced the effectiveness of German artillery and air support. This approach, later described as hugging the enemy, transformed German firepower into a liability. Bombardment became dangerous to German troops as well as Soviet ones. Precision was impossible. The chaos of the battlefield favored those who could endure it.
German tanks remained powerful symbols. Their presence still mattered psychologically, but tactically they were reduced to static fire platforms, mobile pillboxes at best. Fuel shortages worsened, maintenance crews worked under constant threat. Spare parts failed to arrive in sufficient quantities. Crews cannibalized disabled vehicles to keep others running, shrinking the force even without direct enemy action. Each operational tank became more expensive to sustain than the last. Even so, the German High Command refused to abandon its core assumption. Reinforcements were promised, additional tanks were allocated, plans were adjusted, but the belief remained unchanged. If enough force could be applied, the Soviet defense would eventually collapse. It did not. What Germany failed to recognize was that Stalingrad was no longer a battle about territory. It had become a struggle over endurance, and endurance could not be manufactured by tanks. As autumn turned to winter, conditions deteriorated further. Temperatures dropped sharply. Mud froze into deep, uneven ruts of ice. Engines resisted starting. Lubricants thickened and failed. Tracks wore down faster than they could be replaced. Tanks required constant attention simply to remain functional. Every additional vehicle increased the logistical burden without delivering proportional combat power. A tank without fuel or maintenance was not an asset, it was an obligation. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union fought a fundamentally different war. While German industry strained under competing demands and extended supply lines, Soviet factories far to the east operated beyond the reach of German forces. Losses were replaced not with technological superiority, but with consistency and volume. Equipment was simple, durable, and sufficient. Just as importantly, Soviet commanders learned when not to engage German armor, when to absorb pressure, and when to strike elsewhere.
The decisive moment did not come in the ruins of the city itself, but on the open steppes to the north and south. While the Sixth Army fought block by block inside Stalingrad, its flanks were held by Axis allies, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units stretched thin, under-equipped, and lacking effective anti-tank capabilities.
German armor was concentrated where it was least effective, while the sectors where mobility and mass could have mattered most were dangerously exposed. When the Soviet counteroffensive began, it did not aim to destroy German tanks inside the city. It aimed to make them irrelevant. Operation Uranus struck the flanks with overwhelming force. Soviet armored and mechanized formations broke through positions that could not withstand them. The encirclement closed rapidly. Supply routes were severed. The Sixth Army was surrounded. Inside the pocket, German tanks still existed. Some remained operational, many did not. But none could solve the problem now facing the army. They could not break out without fuel. They could not be resupplied in sufficient quantities by air. They could not maneuver across frozen terrain without support. The battle ceased to be about combat power. It became a matter of arithmetic. Each day inside the encirclement consumed fuel, food, ammunition, and medical supplies faster than they could be replaced. Tanks that might have supported a breakout sat idle to conserve fuel that would never arrive in sufficient amounts. Others were destroyed by their own crews once they became immobile. Adding more tanks would not have changed this equation. It would have accelerated the collapse by increasing consumption. As winter deepened, the German position became unsustainable. Soldiers froze, starved, fell ill. Morale eroded not because of a lack of courage, but because the situation itself had become mathematically impossible. No tactical ingenuity, no armored reinforcement, no final act of bravery could alter the underlying imbalance. The Sixth Army was not defeated solely by Soviet firepower. It was defeated by environment, logistics, and the mistaken belief that strength alone could substitute for sustainability. When surrender came in February 1943, it marked more than the destruction of an army. It revealed a fatal flaw in German strategic thinking, the assumption that superior equipment and aggressive doctrine could overcome structural limitations. That belief had worked when campaigns were short, supply lines were manageable, and battles unfolded on terms Germany controlled. Stalingrad was none of those things. Even if Germany had committed more tanks to the battle, the outcome would not have changed. Those tanks would have faced the same terrain, the same shortages, the same encirclement. They would have broken down, run out of fuel, or been abandoned, just like the rest. The battle was not lost because Germany lacked strength. It was lost because strength was applied where it could not function. Stalingrad demonstrated something modern warfare often tries to forget. Technology does not operate in isolation. It depends on time, space, supply, and human endurance. When those elements collapse, even the most formidable weapons become symbols rather than solutions. Germany entered the battle believing tanks could impose order on chaos. Stalingrad proved the opposite. It showed that chaos, once entrenched, consumes everything, steel included.